Hi, this is Freddie DeBoer. I'm coming to you from my new HQ. I want to talk to you briefly about affirmative action today and to emphasize a point that has not been emphasized enough in this long ongoing debate. First, I'm going to start, as I always do, by pointing out that I, in principle, agree with the concept of race conscious college admissions. Under the theory that they function as a kind of reparation for slavery and that they help to adjust for pre-existing inequality in our society that could disadvantage black students in college admissions. But I always have to say in principle, and the reason I have to say in principle is because in practice these programs are implemented by elite colleges and universities, and elite colleges and universities are not selfless organizations that are working purely for the interests of racial equality. They are instead self-interested organizations that are doing this largely for issues of marketing and fundraising. One of the ways that that represents itself is, as I'm sure you've read, in the makeup of who actually receives affirmative action help in these colleges and universities. Uh, we don't know for sure because the colleges don't want to open their books, but it certainly seems as though a majority of the students who are receiving affirmative action preferences in the elite colleges and universities in America today are, for example, the children of wealthy immigrants. So you might have a wealthy Kenyan engineer who moves to the United States, and his first generation child who was born in America into affluence goes on to apply at Harvard or wherever. Or it might be someone who, for example, has one black grandparent and three white grandparents, again, grows up in affluence, but is able to check black on their application because these things, generally speaking, go according to self ID. Both of those students might be a benefit to the college, and you can certainly argue that they are the kind of diversity we would like to see in an elite college or university, but they're also not what most people think affirmative action is for. Most people think about affirmative action in terms of American born descendants of African slaves. And the best evidence that we have available to us is that that's not who is receiving most of the help in these systems. But even that, I think, might be a bit of a distraction, and this is what I want to focus on today. The number of black youth who can be helped by affirmative action at elite colleges and universities is quite small, and I think that it's dramatically smaller than most people seem to understand. In the nonprofit world, you'll sometimes see people talk about the idea of the addressable population, the maximum addressable population, terms to those effect, which mean if our program works well, how many people can it potentially help? And affirmative action is just not a set of programs that has a very large addressable population at all. So if we just sort of break it down, first of all, it remains the case that a majority of black high school graduates do not apply to four-year colleges in the years that we typically associate with applying to college, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Most don't. So right off the bat, you are simply eliminating more than half of the black adolescents who you might think of as people who might be helped by a racial justice program. But much more than that, even within the population of black students who are applying to colleges, it's important to say black students, like all college students, in very large majorities, go to schools, apply to schools that are not competitive at all. I think that this is something people really don't understand. The vast majority of American colleges are not remotely elite or exclusive or competitive. Okay? The vast majority of American colleges and universities accept more students than they reject. A very large number accept essentially anyone who applies. If you can produce a high school diploma and you can sign a promissory note, you can go to college at these places. That's the bulk of American college students. Going to a college where it's hard to get into that college is a profoundly rare phenomenon. You can see various numbers bandied about the number of colleges that reject more students than they accept. You often will see figures like 30% maybe. But even that sort of undersells the reality here, because it's not just that the number of institutions that are competitive or elite or exclusive are small, but they also tend to have significantly lower enrollments than the median college, and so the actual number of students being affected is just very, very small. Then you have to say, okay, what portion of black students, black high school graduates, does affirmative action actually help? Well, it would necessarily have to be the students who, first of all, have any chance at all of getting into a Harvard or Yale or wherever. So there's tons of students of any race who apply to schools they have no business applying to, who take a flyer or whatever and apply to Columbia or Stanford or whatever, even though they have a resume that's never going to get them in. That's true of black students as well as every other race of students. The colleges don't discourage that behavior because they'd like the application fee, thank you. But those students are never going to get in. Then you have the chunk of black students who are going to get in regardless of affirmative action. You have the students who are going to be getting into the schools of their choice, even without any kind of racial preference system. So they're taken out of it. And so what you're left is with this narrow band of students who are among the minority of black high school graduates who do apply to four-year schools, who do apply to elite competitive schools, who are good enough to get into one of the schools that has an affirmative action program, or at least be on the bubble, are not so good that they would certainly get in regardless of the program. It's just not a very large number of people. It's just not. And yet, affirmative action has grown to become this symbol of America's racial progress altogether, which is not very sensible. It remains the case that something like 60% of Americans or more, adults over 25, have no college degree at all. And so we're talking about a subset of a subset of a subset of whom we might be helping with a racial justice program. And this happens too in terms of the arguments, for example, about legacy admissions. So it's very common to say, well, I'm not going to defend affirmative action affirmatively. I'm going to attack legacy admissions. Well, I think legacy admissions are pretty ridiculous also. But for example, a stat that you see often is almost half of Harvard white Harvard students, receive some sort of preference for being a legacy, for playing a sport, for having a faculty parent, or for being on the dean's special interest list, which just means their parents donated, because you don't have to be a legacy. Your just parents need to just donate money. That sounds like a big deal. Oh, almost half of the white kids in Harvard. But Harvard only lets in 1,200 kids a year. Only 40% of those are white. And so if you break it down, we're talking about maybe 250 kids in each Harvard class who got this special preference. There's 10 million teenagers graduate from high school every year. 10 million. And we're talking about 250 of them to make this point about racial justice. It just doesn't make much sense. If you compare this to the child tax credit, there was a expansion to the child tax credit that was passed as part of the COVID bills. It only lasted for 1 year, largely thanks to Joe Manchin. But that program put cash money into the hands of many families, many of them black. It helped tens of millions of people. And it had the potential, according to some analyses, to cut black poverty by a third. Not black child poverty, but black poverty in general by a third. That's just an order of magnitude bigger of a deal when it comes to racial justice than affirmative action. But all the discussion is about affirmative action. It's a permanent fixation of our country's chattering class. Why? Well, because that chattering class is not like most people, right? Our media, our people who work in nonprofits, people who work in academia, people who work in government, these are people who overwhelmingly went to elite colleges themselves and really have no sort of perspective or mind frame outside of that experience. When they were a teenager, all they were doing was worrying about getting into the right college. Then they went to the right college and they hustled there. The friends they made were at competitive colleges. They graduate into the New York Times or into the Department of Education or into the Ford Foundation or to working for a local nonprofit. And all the people around them also went to elite schools. And so they just cannot conceive of what it's like to think about college as something other than a meritocratic system for people at the top 1%. That's a mistake. If we want to be serious about racial justice in this country, we have to address solutions like the child tax credit that create opportunity for the black students who are the least competitive, right? One of the things that makes this most perverse is that affirmative action helps those black students who are already the most upwardly mobile, who are already the ones who have the most social capital and are in the best position to move forward. None of this is necessarily an argument against the use of racial preferences. How you use them, obviously, is very, very important. But I would like a little perspective here. This just isn't that big of a deal. And I think it's indicative of how broken the American racial conversation is, that this has been the fixation of that racial conversation for a month. Thanks, I appreciate your time.